June 1940, Temuka, South Canterbury, New Zealand, where workers at the Public Works Department depot gathered around an International Harvester Caterpillar D8 bulldozer that had been commandeered from civilian road construction projects and was being transformed through improvised engineering into what the newspapers would soon call the Bob Semple tank, an armored fighting vehicle named after Robert Semple, the 69-year-old Minister of Public Works whose former career as a militant trade unionist and boxer from the rough mining camps of New South Wales had given him the nickname Fighting Bob, and whose combative personality would prove perfectly suited to the desperate improvisation required when New Zealand found itself virtually defenseless against the prospect of Japanese invasion. The fall of France just weeks earlier in May 1940 had shocked the world and demonstrated that even nations with substantial military establishments could be overrun within weeks by coordinated mechanized warfare, and the collapse of British, French, and Dutch colonial defenses across Southeast Asia during December 1941 through March 1942 would create a situation where New Zealand and Australia stood exposed to Japanese expansion with only 6 Bren gun carriers representing the entire armored force available to defend the New Zealand Islands against an enemy that had already demonstrated willingness and capability to project military power across thousands of miles of ocean. Britain, fighting for its own survival against Nazi Germany and facing the very real possibility of invasion across the English Channel, could spare no military equipment for its distant Pacific dominions, and the United States, though friendly, was not yet at war and had no obligation to defend territories that technically belonged to the British Empire, leaving New Zealand's government to confront the terrifying reality that if the Japanese decided to invade, there would be almost nothing to stop them from conquering islands whose population of approximately 1.6 million people could not possibly resist the battle-hardened divisions that had swept through China, the Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, and the Dutch East Indies with apparent ease. Semple, whose responsibilities as Minister of Public Works included oversight of the nation's infrastructure projects and access to heavy equipment including bulldozers, road graders, and other tracked vehicles, recognized that New Zealand possessed resources that, while unsuitable for conventional military purposes, might be adapted through necessity and ingenuity into defensive capabilities that could at minimum demonstrate resistance and boost civilian morale, even if they could not seriously challenge Japanese military technology. And he proposed converting agricultural and construction tractors into improvised tanks that would combine available armor plate with the tracked mobility of bulldozers to create fighting vehicles that might slow or harass invading forces long enough for reinforcements to arrive from Australia or the United States, or for New Zealand's own mobilization to coalesce into organized resistance rather than immediate collapse under initial Japanese assault. The concept was not entirely original, as the American Diston tractor tank had demonstrated in 1937 that commercial tractors could be fitted with armored superstructures to create vehicles that, while inferior to purpose-built tanks, could provide protected mobility. The prototype that emerged from the Temuka depot workshops during June and July 1940 represented both remarkable achievement and practical failure, demonstrating the ingenuity and determination that characterized New Zealand's no-8-wire culture of making do with available resources while simultaneously revealing the limitations that prevented amateur engineering from producing militarily viable weapon systems, regardless of how dedicated the effort or how pure the intentions behind the work. The base vehicle was a Caterpillar D8 bulldozer, a 6-ton tracked tractor powered by a 6-cylinder diesel engine, producing approximately 127 horsepower, sufficient for moving earth and pulling heavy loads but marginal when burdened with additional weight of armor plating and weapons and crew that would eventually push the completed vehicle's mass toward 20 to 25 tons, more than 3 times the tractor's original design weight and far beyond what its suspension, transmission, and powertrain had been engineered to handle. The armor consisted of 2 layers, an inner shell of 8mm welded steel plate, obtained from Australian sources covered by an outer layer of 12.7mm corrugated manganese steel, the latter chosen because corrugated material was readily available from building supply stocks, normally used for roofing, and because the ridged surface was believed to help deflect incoming bullets. And while this combination was tested and found capable of stopping anti-tank rifle rounds up to 20mm caliber, it provided no protection against the 37mm armor-piercing shells fired by Japanese tank cannons that would punch through the improvised armor as easily as paper. The superstructure, designed by T.G. Beck, the Christchurch District Works engineer, who collaborated with Semple on translating rough sketches into actual construction plans, was a boxy arrangement approximately 10 feet wide and 13 feet long, standing nearly 12 feet tall, dimensions that created a vehicle whose height made it inherently unstable and whose profile presented an enormous target that would be visible from great distances and that could not take advantage of terrain features that properly designed tanks used for cover and concealment. Armament consisted of 6 Bren light machine guns, reliable weapons in infantry service, but woefully inadequate for tank versus tank combat, positioned to provide fire in all directions with 2 guns facing forward, one each to port and starboard, one covering the rear arc, and one mounted in a fixed turret on top of the superstructure, an arrangement that required an 8-man crew to operate all weapons simultaneously. Though in practice the vehicle's violent shaking made accurate fire essentially impossible, and the need to stop completely before changing gears meant that any attempt at mobile warfare would leave the Bob Semple tank vulnerable during the seconds required to shift from one gear to another. The transmission represented perhaps the most crippling flaw, as the original bulldozer gearbox had been replaced with an improved 2-to-1 ratio unit, but the fundamental limitation that the vehicle had to come to complete halt before gears could be engaged meant that any tactical maneuver requiring speed changes would interrupt momentum and leave the tank stationary and defenseless while the driver wrestled with the clutch and gear lever, a vulnerability that Japanese forces could exploit mercilessly in any actual combat situation where mobility and rapid response to threats determined survival. The political and public reaction to the Bob Semple tank revealed deep tensions within New Zealand society between those who appreciated the vehicle as symbol of national determination to resist despite overwhelming odds, and those who viewed it as embarrassing proof that the nation lacked industrial capacity and technical expertise to produce genuine military hardware comparable to what the great powers fielded as standard equipment, tensions that Semple himself embodied through his defiant insistence that criticism missed the point, and that doing something was preferable to doing nothing, even if that something was admittedly imperfect. When the first prototype was completed, in late 1940, and displayed to military authorities including Major General Puttick, who commanded New Zealand's home forces, the response was diplomatically cautious, with officials praising the initiative and the resourcefulness while privately expressing reservations about the vehicle's combat effectiveness and its suitability for any role beyond static defense of beach positions, where its limited mobility would be less problematic than in mobile operations, requiring rapid movement and tactical flexibility. Semple, whose political career had been built on confrontational rhetoric and working-class populism, responded to skepticism with characteristic pugnacity, declaring in Parliament and in newspaper interviews that critics who mocked the tank without offering better alternatives were defeatists whose complaints contributed nothing to national defense. And in one famous exchange, when a political opponent sarcastically suggested that Semple's tanks had probably stopped the Japanese advance, the minister responded without embarrassment that if the tanks had indeed contributed to Japanese decision-making about whether to attempt invasion, then they had served their purpose regardless of their technical shortcomings. Public displays of the Bob Semple tank in Christchurch, Wellington and Auckland during 1941 drew enthusiastic crowds who saw in the vehicle evidence that New Zealand would fight rather than surrender, that ordinary Kiwis could transform tractors into weapons if necessary, and that the same pragmatic ingenuity that had built a nation from colonial outpost to independent democracy could be applied to military challenges, even if the results were unorthodox by conventional standards. And these parades and exhibitions served primarily as morale-boosting exercises that demonstrated resolve, rather than as serious attempts to convince anyone that the Bob Semple tank represented credible military hardware. University students at Canterbury College and Auckland University College lampooned the tank in their annual capping processions, creating floats labelled the Septic Tank that featured cardboard mock-ups of Semple's design, adorned with jokes about its alleged capabilities, satirical performances that Semple tolerated with surprising good humour while maintaining publicly that the critics simply did not understand that perfection was impossible, and the technical problems that plagued the Bob Semple tank extended beyond its obvious deficiencies in armor protection and firepower to include fundamental mechanical and operational issues that would have prevented effective use even against relatively unsophisticated opposition, revealing how the gulf between agricultural equipment and military vehicles involved not just armor and weapons, but entire systems of engineering that addressed reliability, maintainability, and crew survivability under combat conditions. The six-cylinder diesel engine, adequate for bulldozer operations conducted at steady speeds over relatively short periods with frequent breaks for repositioning, proved inadequate when required to move 20-plus tons of armored vehicle at speeds approaching 14 miles per hour, which represented the Bob Semple's maximum velocity on roads and which was less than half the speed of contemporary light tanks and slower than infantry could march over extended distances, making the vehicle vulnerable to being outflanked by any mobile enemy force and limiting its tactical utility to purely static, defensive positions where its immobility would not compromise whatever limited combat value its weapons and armor might provide. The suspension system designed for bulldozer work where slow speeds and gradual movements were normal could not adequately dampen the vibrations and shocks generated when the overloaded chassis moved at maximum speed across uneven terrain, creating conditions inside the crew compartment that were described by test drivers as almost unbearably violent, with metal surfaces rattling and shaking so severely that loose equipment became projectiles and crew members had to brace themselves constantly to avoid being thrown against hard surfaces that could cause serious injury even in the absence of enemy fire, and these vibrations made operating the Bren guns essentially impossible during movement because the weapon's sights jumped and wobbled unpredictably and because empty cartridge cases ejected from the guns bounced around the interior, creating additional hazards. The visibility from inside the armored superstructure was severely limited, with small vision slits providing only narrow fields of view that left large blind spots where enemy infantry could approach without being seen. A vulnerability that proper tank designs addressed through multiple periscopes and cupolas that allowed commanders and drivers to maintain situational awareness without exposing themselves to enemy fire. And the Bob Semple's lack of such equipment meant that crew members would be operating essentially blind during combat, with only fragmentary understanding of what was happening around their vehicle or where threats might be approaching. The crew accommodation was primitive, even by wartime standards, with 8 men crammed into the boxy superstructure, without proper seats or safety restraints, and with inadequate ventilation that would have made the interior unbearably hot during summer operations, and that would fill with diesel fumes and gun smoke during any sustained firing, creating conditions that would the ultimate fate of the Bob Semple tank program demonstrated that even determined improvisation could not overcome fundamental limitations imposed by inadequate resources, insufficient technical expertise, and the simple reality that tractors, designed for civilian purposes, could not be transformed into effective military vehicles without comprehensive redesign that would negate the time and cost advantages that had motivated the tractor tank concept in the first place. But the project's symbolic significance and its demonstration of New Zealand's willingness to attempt self-defense regardless of odds would prove more valuable than any tactical contribution the vehicles might have made in actual combat. Only 3 or 4 complete Bob Semple tanks were ever constructed, depending on how the counting was done, with vehicles receiving Army serial numbers NZ6292, NZ3494 and NZ3495, and after military authorities concluded that the tanks were unsuitable for combat service, all were dismantled during 1941 and 1942 with their armor removed and the bulldozers returned to civilian infrastructure, projects where they served usefully for years, moving earth and constructing roads rather than failing to stop. Japanese tanks that never came, and one chassis was reportedly shipped to the Pacific Theater in 1944. After being stripped of armor, though what purpose it served, there remains unclear from available records. The tanks never fired a shot in anger, never defended New Zealand's shores against invasion, never proved their worth or lack thereof in actual combat conditions, and their greatest contribution to the war effort was arguably the morale boost they provided to civilian populations who needed to believe that their nation would resist, even if that resistance took the form of improvised armor welded onto bulldozers. Demonstrations that New Zealand would not surrender without fighting, regardless of how unequal the fight might be. Major General Young, Dominion commander of the Home Guard who toured with Semple during 1940, promoting home defense, perhaps best captured the significance of the Bob Semple tank when he said of the minister that he had a will to win the war and that when a man possessed such will, nothing could stop him. Words that applied not to the tank itself, which clearly could be stopped quite easily by almost any opposition, but rather to the spirit of resistance and self-reliance that the tank represented, and that would characterize New Zealand's contribution to Allied victory through service overseas rather than through home defense that fortunately never became necessary. The broader context of improvised armored vehicles during World War II reveals that Bob Semple's tractor tank was neither unique nor particularly unsuccessful when measured against the standards of other desperate nations that found themselves transforming agricultural and construction equipment into fighting vehicles during the war's early years, when industrial capacity could not keep pace with military needs, and when the alternative to improvisation was simply accepting defeat without resistance. And examining these parallel efforts across multiple theaters demonstrates both the universality of human ingenuity under pressure and the stark differences between improvisation, conducted as symbolic gesture, versus improvisation, driven by immediate combat necessity. The Soviet Union, facing catastrophic equipment losses during the initial months of Operation Barbarossa, when German forces destroyed thousands of tanks during encirclement battles that consumed entire Soviet armies, and when evacuation of Western industrial centers meant that tank production temporarily collapsed precisely when the Red Army needed armor most desperately, produced numerous improvised fighting vehicles that, while crude, represented genuine attempts to field combat-capable systems rather than purely symbolic demonstrations of resistance. The NI tank, officially designated Na Ispug, which translated literally as for fright or more idiomatically as terror tank, emerged from the January uprising mechanical plant in Odessa during August 1941, when the city found itself besieged by combined German and Romanian forces, and when the defending Soviet units discovered that their tank strength was insufficient to conduct the counterattacks necessary to prevent the enemy from consolidating positions around the city's perimeter and eventually overwhelming its defenses through sustained pressure that would grind down Soviet resistance through attrition, if not decisively defeated through mobile operations that required armor superiority. The NI was based on the STZ-5 agricultural tractor, a 7-ton tracked vehicle produced at the Stalingrad tractor factory and widely distributed throughout Soviet collective farms, where it served reliably in conditions that required robustness and maintainability rather than speed or sophistication. And workers at the January uprising plant welded steel plates salvaged from damaged ships and boilers onto these tractors to create armored boxes that provided protection against small arms fire and shell fragments while mounting turrets salvaged from destroyed T-26 light tanks or improvised turrets fitted with 37mm mountain guns or 45mm anti-tank weapons, or in some desperate cases, simply wooden logs painted black to simulate cannon barrels, in hopes that enemy infantry would mistake these fake guns for real weapons and would retreat rather than risk close assault against what appeared to be properly armed tanks. The NI tanks made horrific noise when moving, a cacophony of clanking metal and grinding gears and roaring diesel engines that could be heard from considerable distances and that contributed significantly to their psychological impact on enemy forces who heard these mechanical monsters approaching in darkness, and who often panicked and retreated, believing they faced proper Soviet armor rather than improvised tractors that could barely exceed 20 kilometers per hour and whose thin armor would be penetrated easily by German anti-tank weapons if the enemy had possessed the composure to stand and fight rather than fleeing in terror. During the 73-day siege of Odessa that lasted from August 8th through October 16th, 1941, approximately 69 NI tanks were produced, and the comparison between the Bob Semple tank and the Soviet NI reveals fundamental differences between improvisation, conducted primarily for domestic political and morale purposes, versus improvisation driven by immediate military necessity where symbolic value was secondary to actual combat effectiveness, differences that illuminate how context and intent shape both the design process and the ultimate evaluation of whether particular improvised solutions represent success or failure when measured against the objectives they were meant to achieve. The Bob Semple tank was conceived and constructed in circumstances where New Zealand faced no immediate invasion threat, despite genuine anxieties about Japanese intentions, where the time frame for development extended over months rather than weeks, and where perfectionism could compete with pragmatism because no enemy stood at the gates requiring immediate deployment of whatever equipment could be fielded regardless of its inadequacies. And these relatively benign conditions meant that Semple and his engineers could afford to prioritize features like comprehensive armor coverage and multiple weapon systems and crew comfort over more fundamental concerns like whether the vehicle could actually move at tactically useful speeds, or whether its guns could be aimed accurately, or whether its armor would protect against anything more serious than rifle fire. The NI tank, in contrast, was designed and built under siege conditions, where German and Romanian artillery was literally falling on Odessa while workers welded armor plates to tractors, where Soviet infantry was dying in trenches just kilometers from the factory and desperately needed any armored support that could be provided, even if that support consisted of tractors that could barely move and whose armor was minimal. And these urgent circumstances meant that Soviet engineers prioritized speed of production and immediate deployability over refinements that might have improved performance but that would have delayed fielding vehicles that were needed immediately to support counterattacks that could not wait for proper tanks to arrive from factories that had been evacuated hundreds of kilometers eastward. The Soviet approach resulted in crude vehicles that nonetheless saw extensive combat and that achieved genuine tactical successes, including defeating Romanian infantry formations and capturing enemy artillery despite their obvious technical limitations, successes that justified the NI program, even though the vehicles themselves would have been death traps if confronted by German armor or properly trained anti-tank units, while the New Zealand approach produced vehicles that were arguably more sophisticated in design, but that never faced any test more challenging than public parades, and that were dismantled without ever determining whether they could have fulfilled any useful military function, because the invasion threat they were meant to address never materialized. This comparison reveals that improvised weapon systems cannot be evaluated purely on technical merits, but must be understood in terms of the specific contexts that generated them, the objectives they were meant to achieve, and the constraints under which they were developed, with success or failure depending less on whether the vehicles met abstract standards of military effectiveness and more on whether they accomplished what their creators intended within the limitations imposed by available resources, time, and circumstances. The Soviets needed. The impact of the Bob Semple tank experience on New Zealand's national self-image and military development extended far beyond the immediate wartime context, shaping how post-war generations of New Zealanders understood their nation's character, its relationship with more powerful allies, and its capacity to respond to external threats through self-reliance and improvisation when outside assistance proved unavailable or insufficient, creating narratives that emphasized ingenuity and determination, while often obscuring the more sobering reality that small nations facing serious military threats from major powers cannot improvise their way to security regardless of how resourceful or determined their populations might be. The Bob Semple tank became part of New Zealand folklore, referenced in popular culture and historical memory as an example of Kiwi can-do attitude, celebrated in museum exhibits and historical reenactments and internet memes that portrayed the vehicle as charmingly eccentric evidence of national character rather than as embarrassing proof of military inadequacy. And this rehabilitation of the Bob Semple's reputation reflected a broader pattern in how nations construct historical narratives that emphasize positive aspects of wartime experiences while downplaying or reinterpreting elements that challenge preferred national mythologies about courage, competence, and contribution to Allied victory. The actual military lessons that New Zealand authorities drew from the Bob Semple experience were more pragmatic and less celebratory, recognizing that future defense planning could not rely on improvisation, but instead required either maintaining sufficient peacetime military forces to deter aggression and respond to initial attacks without depending on makeshift solutions, or accepting fundamental dependency on more powerful allies, particularly the United States, whose emerging superpower status made it the only nation capable of providing security guarantees that would actually deter potential aggressors from attacking New Zealand or Australia. The post-war ANZUS Treaty, signed in September 1951, formalized this dependency, committing the United States to defend both Australia and New Zealand against armed attack in exchange for these nations supporting American strategic interests in the Pacific region, an arrangement that acknowledged the reality that neither dominion could defend itself against serious military threats without American assistance, and that improvised tractor tanks represented desperate expedients rather than viable military strategies. The development of New Zealand's actual military capabilities during the decades following World War II reflected this understanding, with defense forces focusing on specialized capabilities that could contribute to collective security arrangements, rather than attempting to maintain comprehensive forces capable of independent action, and with procurement decisions prioritizing interoperability with American and Australian equipment over development of indigenous systems that New Zealand's limited industrial base and small defense budget could never produce in sufficient quantities or quality to make meaningful differences in major conflicts. The Bob Semple tank became a cautionary tale within New Zealand defense circles about the dangers of believing that improvisation and ingenuity could substitute for proper military preparation, and about the impossibility of small nations maintaining military independence in an era when warfare required industrial-scale production of sophisticated equipment that only major powers could afford to develop and deploy. But this cautionary interpretation coexisted uneasily with the more popular narrative that celebrated the tank as evidence of national character and resourcefulness, creating tensions between professional military planners who understood New Zealand's vulnerabilities and popular order. The cultural memory and historical reassessment of improvised armored vehicles, including both the Bob Semple tank and the Soviet NI, has evolved substantially over the decades since World War II ended, shifting from contemporary dismissal or embarrassment toward more nuanced appreciation of what these vehicles represented about human responses to crisis and about the complex relationships between technical capability, psychological factors, and military effectiveness in contexts where conventional metrics of success and failure become difficult to apply. The Bob Semple tank, which was largely forgotten during the immediate post-war decades, when New Zealand was focused on developing proper military forces, and when memories of the vehicle's inadequacies remained fresh among veterans and defense officials, experienced rehabilitation beginning in the 1980s and accelerating through the Internet era, when the tank became a subject of fascinated discussion on military history, forums and YouTube channels and social media platforms, where its peculiar combination of ambitious design and practical failure made it perfect material for the kind of affectionately mocking content that characterizes much online military history discourse. The tank's elevation to meme status beginning in the 2010s transformed it from obscure historical footnote into widely recognized cultural reference, with jokes about the Bob Semple's alleged invincibility and claims that it was the greatest tank ever built, becoming running gags in online communities interested in military equipment. And while this mimetic status often involved deliberate exaggeration and ironic celebration of the vehicle's inadequacies, it simultaneously introduced the Bob Semple tank to global audiences who might never have encountered this obscure piece of New Zealand military history through conventional historical channels. This internet fame prompted more serious historical research and documentation efforts, including detailed reconstructions of the tank's specifications and performance characteristics, investigations into how many were actually built and what happened to them after the program was cancelled, and analyses of the political and strategic contexts that motivated Semple's decisions and that shaped how the tanks were received by military authorities and public audiences. Scholarly work that has produced more nuanced understanding of the Bob Semple tank as historical artifact and cultural symbol. Similar rehabilitation has occurred with the Soviet NI tank, which during the Soviet era was largely forgotten or dismissed as embarrassing evidence of Red Army unpreparedness during 1941, but which has been reassessed in post-Soviet Russia and Ukraine as inspiring example of civilian workers' contribution to defending their cities against fascist aggression, with multiple museum replicas constructed in Odessa, and with the NI featuring in Ukrainian historical narratives about resistance and self-sacrifice during the Great Patriotic War. This shift in how both the Bob Semple and the NI are remembered reflects broader changes in how military history is understood and valued, with increasing recognition that wars are not just stories about generals and grand strategy, but also about ordinary people making difficult choices under extraordinary circumstances, about how society, the ultimate lessons about innovation, desperation, and national character that emerge from studying Bob Semple's tractor tank and similar improvised vehicles. From World War II extend beyond the specific technical and military dimensions of these projects to encompass broader questions about how societies respond to crisis, about when improvisation represents genuine problem-solving versus symbolic gestures, and about the complex relationships between individual agency and structural constraints in determining what nations can achieve through determination and creativity when confronting challenges that exceed their apparent capabilities. The Bob Semple tank demonstrated both the possibilities and limitations of improvisation under pressure, showing that individuals with sufficient determination and access to resources can indeed produce functional vehicles from civilian equipment within remarkably short time frames, but also revealing that such improvisation cannot substitute for proper military-industrial capacity when facing serious threats from well-equipped enemies whose advantages in technology and production cannot be overcome through ingenuity alone, regardless of how resourceful the improvisation might be. The contrast between the Bob Semple's symbolic function and the Soviet NI's combat role illuminates how context fundamentally shapes both the design and evaluation of improvised solutions, with the same basic concept of armoring tractors, producing radically different results depending on whether the objective is demonstrating national resolve or achieving immediate tactical effects against enemy forces, who are literally besieging the city where the vehicles are being constructed. The fact that the Bob Semple tank never saw combat while the NI tanks fought in multiple engagements does not necessarily mean the Soviet approach was superior, because the objectives were different and the measures of success were different, with New Zealand seeking primarily to boost morale and demonstrate willingness to resist, while the Soviets desperately needed anything that could move and shoot regardless of how crude or vulnerable. And evaluating either project requires understanding what its creators intended to achieve, rather than applying abstract standards that ignore the specific contexts and constraints that shaped these improvisations. The broader pattern of improvised armored vehicles throughout World War II, including not just the Bob Semple and the NI, but also British Home Guard vehicles like the Bison, armored concrete truck, and the armadillo truck with welded steel, plates and Polish insurgents' improvised vehicles. During the Warsaw Uprising and various other desperate attempts to create armor from whatever materials were available demonstrates that when nations and communities face existential threats, they will attempt to defend themselves using whatever means they can improvise, regardless of whether military professionals consider those means viable. And that human determination to resist rather than surrender will manifest in creative efforts to transform civilian resources into military capabilities, even when those efforts are unlikely to succeed in purely military terms. These improvised vehicles represent something essential about human nature and about how people respond to crisis, demonstrating that the choice to act, rather than to accept defeat passively, has value beyond purely practical calculations of effectiveness. That symbolic demonstrations of